Part of the king's duties were to keep the universe running in order. When I taught ancient Egyptian history at school, the suggestion of women being kings in ancient Egypt usually got at least one or two students to say, "But only boys can be kings." But in ancient Egypt, that's just not true. That may be true in most other countries around the world, but in ancient Egypt it was actually possible for a woman to become king, and several women did. While most people use the words king and queen as gender-specific terms for a monarch, in ancient Egypt what it meant to be king was something that could actually transcend gender. Before I get further into this, let me just clarify that even though it seems terribly progressive for a country to allow women to be kings, ancient Egypt was a patriarchal society. It's not so much that they were pro-women, it's just that they were less anti-woman than most other countries. Or at least, ancient Egypt wasn't nearly as anti-women as ancient Greece. But why not? Stories matter. It's always worthwhile to look into the founding myths of any given culture to understand their worldview. The ancient Greek religion and Christianity both have some myths that are very anti-woman. For instance, in Christianity, it's the myth of Eve eating the apple that causes humanity to get kicked out of the Garden of Eden. The ancient Greeks have the myth of Pandora, the first woman created by the gods as a punishment for humanity, who brought with her a vessel carrying all the troubles of the world. The ancient Egyptians don't have any stories in which women are the bringers of evil, like those two stories. Ancient Egyptian stories do not hold women accountable for any such evils. Instead, ancient Egyptian stories are focused on the necessity of men and women coming together to create life, which was sacred to them. These stories are more focused on the roles women could play as protecting and supporting the important men in their lives, their fathers, their husbands, their sons, and their brothers. Ancient Egyptian laws allowed women to have much more freedom than most other countries in the ancient world. For instance, ancient Egyptian women could own property, even businesses, could sue and be sued in a court of law, and could divorce their husbands if they chose to. None of those freedoms were allowed to women in ancient Greece. They couldn't even leave their homes unless escorted by a male member of their own family, and they had to be veiled from head to toe. Sound familiar? However, in spite of all the freedoms ancient Egyptian women did enjoy, they were still not on an equal footing with men. It was absolutely still a patriarchy. The ancient Egyptian worldview was largely oriented around the necessity of maintaining cosmic order through one male figure, the god king. Women could become kings, yes, but they were the exception to the rule, and this only happened a handful of times and under very unusual circumstances. So, how was this possible? Why wouldn't an ancient Egyptian female ruler just be called a queen, even if she was ruling by herself? In ancient Egypt, king and queen were two totally distinct and separate jobs. Religion and government in ancient Egypt were one and the same. This meant that every priest in all of Egypt was also a government official, and that the king was the highest-ranked priest in the whole land. The king of Egypt was also believed to share the royal ka with every king who had lived before him. The ka is an important aspect of the soul in ancient Egyptian belief. A queen wouldn't have shared the royal ka like her husband would have. The king was also uniquely responsible for his ability to communicate with the gods on behalf of the people of Egypt. He had to make sure the sun successfully completed its journey across the sky every day, that the Nile flooded its banks like it was supposed to each season, and that the crops grew and flourished. In other words, part of the king's duties were to keep the universe running in order. And of course, he also had the usual responsibilities of any king, making war to protect his country, defending the borders, collecting taxes, passing laws, all that sort of thing. The queen's job was to protect and support her husband politically and to provide him with an heir to the throne. In other words, there was no point in having a queen unless there was a king for her to support. But if a female Egyptian monarch had the support of the priests and, presumably, the gods, she could become a king. And at several times in Egypt's history, that's exactly what happened. So, why did that happen? Remember that to be a king, one had to be born a king, or at least that's how that was supposed to happen. But in ancient Egypt, infant mortality rate was really high. It was extremely rare for a baby born to survive infancy, let alone childhood. That being the case, Egyptian kings kept harems, having many children with multiple different women in order to hedge their bets and make sure that there would always be an heir to the throne. Every once in a while, however, a king lived so long he outlived all of his heirs. When that happened, it could become very confusing to figure out who was supposed to rule Egypt next. Some kings, despite their efforts, also didn't have any biological heirs at all. This was a problem that frequently occurred due to incest. Ancient Egyptians had a tradition, in the monarchy, of kings marrying their own siblings and having children with them. After one generation of a king marrying his sister, having a child, then their children marrying each other and trying to have children, descendants quickly became sterile and unable to reproduce at all. Any of these crises might lead to a situation where the most qualified royal person left alive was a woman. And it seems that in those cases enough of the Egyptian nobility agreed it was better to be ruled by a woman than to simply let the dynasty end in chaos. When a dynasty came to an end, that might mean that there could be some confusion about who would take power next. This could be anything as small as a coup d'etat to anything as full-scale as a massive civil war. The nobility never wanted any of these circumstances to occur if they could avoid it. Allowing a female descendant of the last king to take power was a great way to buy themselves some time in order to sort of get their ducks in a row and figure out how they'd like the power to be transferred after her rule. The most successful example of a female king in ancient Egypt was Hatshepsut, but she wasn't the first. She was preceded by at least one, maybe even two, other female kings. Some Egyptologists are also convinced that the famous and beautiful Nefertiti may also have become a female king of Egypt, while her husband was still alive and ruling. If you'd like to know more about that, and if you enjoyed this video, check out my Patreon where you can take more in-depth classes about ancient Egypt, its gods, and its rulers. We'll do a deep dive on lots of specific individuals throughout Egypt's history. Lots of fun. I really hope to see you there! In the ancient Greek religion, the ancient Egyptian worldview was bleh. If you enjoyed this video, check out my Patreon where you can take more classes, and I lost the rest of my sentence. Off you go.